our press secretary, gave alternative facts to that.
My goal in this deposition was to be truthful, but not particularly helpful.
Welcome to Unspun, the podcast that makes you better at finding the truth. The way people get news is changing. It used to be that there were many reporters who would research stories and write articles, but now politicians and famous people share information directly with you on social media and the internet. That means you find out things fast, but it's up to you to make sure the information's actually accurate. And newsmakers don't always do their part. The temptation to manipulate information is strong. They bend the truth to deceive so that they can avoid accountability, so that they can advance their agendas. When you recognize these agendas, you can sometimes find out what's real. And we're at a crossroads where anyone can share anything online, so it's important to sharpen your critical thinking skills. Finding that deception before it goes viral is pretty much a survival skill now, and we're going to do it together. Let's get unspun. Hello, truth seekers, and welcome to this week's Unspun. In this week's episode, we're going to find out if it's really okay to play someone's song at your campaign rally. And also, my guest and I will talk about a program that trains up young adults to work in campaigns. You won't want to miss my conversation with Kyle Spencer, author of Raising Them Right. Sound good? Let's get unspun. Before we get started, I wanted to say a big thanks to Betsy. Betsy took the time out of her day to write to me with some ideas about the show. I always love hearing from you, and I would welcome your email at TheUnspunPodcast.gmail.com. And also, we're turning 1! It's been a year since I started this podcast, and I have had such a great time finding examples of newsmakers being deceptive to share with you. And I hope you'll help me celebrate. If you sign up for my free Substack at TheUnspunPodcast.substack.com, you can get your own invite to a special live stream with me. We'll look at some examples of newsmakers, and you can ask me anything you want. So I hope to see you there. But remember, first you'll need to sign up at TheUnspunPodcast.substack.com. Okay, let's get unspun. It's becoming a familiar story. A candidate's having a rally, and they walk out to some familiar fist-pumping music. And then afterwards, the band or the singer issues a statement saying they don't endorse the candidate, or maybe their lawyer or record company issues a cease and desist to the campaign. So what are the rules around campaigns using people's songs? To find out, I invited back friend of the show, Israel Balderas, who's both a professor of media law and a licensed attorney. Israel, I'm so glad to have you back with me on Unspun. So tell me, what's the deal? Can campaigns use other people's music and get away with it?
That's a great question, Amanda, and it highlights the complexity of this legal dilemma. The short answer is it can be legal, even if the artist objects, but it depends on the specific circumstances. Basically, when campaigns use music at rallies, they're dealing with copyright law. The key thing to understand here is that there are multiple rights involved in a single piece of music. There's the copyright for the composition. That's the lyrics and melody. Then there's a separate copyright for the actual recording. Campaigns need permission for both, unless they're covered by a license. Now, many venues have blanket licenses from performing rights organizations like ASCAP or BMI. These cover a lot of songs for public performance. So if a campaign or venue has one of these licenses, they might have the legal right to play the song, even if the artist isn't happy about it. But, and this is crucial, artists can sometimes opt out of allowing their music to be used for political purposes. Now, that's copyright law. And then there's an artist's right of publicity, which is separate from copyright law, and it adds another layer to this complex issue. While copyright protects the work itself, the right of publicity protects a person's name, image, or likeness from being used without permission, especially for commercial purposes. Now, in the context of political campaigns, using an artist's music could potentially violate their right of publicity if it creates the impression that the artist endorses the candidate. This is sometimes called false endorsement. So, a campaign might have the right to play the song, but if using it implies the artist supports the candidate, that could violate the artist's right of publicity. It's why some artists have successfully stopped campaigns from using their music, even when the campaign had a valid copyright license.
I'm going to need to take a quick break, and I'll be back soon. Welcome back. My guest this week is Kyle Spencer. Kyle's an award-winning journalist with publications in outlets like the New York Times, Politico, and the International Herald Tribune. Her book, Raising the Right, comes out in paperback in September. The Kirkus Review called that book an eye-opening report on the rise of ultra-conservatism, and we're really happy to have her on Unspun this week. Welcome, Kyle. I wanted to start by saying that I really did enjoy the book, and one of the things that interested me a lot was kind of the story behind the story, right? So you went into how particular funders and conservative influencers were creating this concerted effort to not just kind of interest, but actually mobilize young conservatives. And the thing that I found fascinating was how much of a long game this seemed to be. So, I'm a professor myself, and I know that we have conversations at work about whether we're making enough space for students who have a variety of political views, and in particular conservative views at my school. And I know that influencers are saying loudly that we don't do a good job of that. But here's what I'm curious about. What did you actually find on the ground on campuses in your interviews? Is there actually suppression of some points of view, or do students say they feel that way?
So, I'm not always sure that I trust these surveys on whether young people feel like they can't voice their own their opinions. There are a lot of conservative organizations that like to do these polls, and then they find in the polls that many people are saying they can't express themselves. What I think may be happening here to some extent is that in addition to some of the conservative kids who may feel like they're unable to express themselves, I am quite certain that there are a lot of kids of color, minority kids, who also feel kids who are members of the LGBTQ community that also feel like they can't openly speak out, particularly in certain campuses in red states or in swing states. So the reason I wrote the book was because I believed that the storyline we were hearing around the country that kids couldn't voice their opinions, progressive kids were intolerant and shutting everyone down. And I didn't think I wasn't seeing it on large state school campuses. I think you may see that on small progressive, small liberal arts campuses. But in large state campuses, there's a battle going on and between progressives and conservative kids. And I think it happens a lot on the quad. It's very well funded. And what I found was the loudest people were really the well-funded conservative organizations that tabled with, lots of swag and whatnot. And we can talk a little bit more about how they do the work. I do want to say this. If you have, I think we all know, we can't be black and white about this. We all know young people who are intolerant, right? Young people who will say, you can't say that, that's racist, that's this, that's that. People that were sort of tiptoeing around. We know that's true. But what we also have on the right, on these extremist right-wingers, is a lot of bullying that has veered into the physical. So that at Arizona State University, you had an LGBTQ professor who was harassed and then basically beaten by, you got into an altercation with Turning Point USA members on the campus or members of the organization. You have instances of students holding up signs, huge signs. One of them I saw at the University of Florida, which this is Turning Point USA sign. We believe in choice, or we're pro-choice. And then there's 3 or 4 military grade weapons on the signs, and they're huge and they're daunting and they're scary and they're alarming. And those efforts are very real and they're very intentional. So when you look at it, there's not parity here. You have one group that, maybe there's some intolerance. This group would argue intolerance for good, and then there's this other group that will often veer into the actual threatening. And of course, the other group, which can veer into the threatening, are people who believe in arming students, because one of the big things I saw and found on college campuses around the country were major efforts from extremist groups to push legislation that would allow students to have basically carry guns in their knapsacks to your class.
I'm wondering though, would the conservative groups also say that they are being intolerant for good?
Yeah, they might argue that. Yeah. I would argue that is not the case. I would argue that what we find now with radical extremist conservatives, that they've really passed and are openly express their distaste for democracy. I think once you start expressing a disinterest in democracy, When you live in a democratic country, that becomes a huge problem. And if you're a journalist and you must be pro-democracy because it's the democratic values that allow you to have a free press, then these types of people and their views are now no longer, they're fringe and they're alarming and they're worrisome. They're not in a democracy on the side of good.
Okay, fair enough with that. One of the things that you did for the book was follow the support back to some of the original sources. Could you talk a little bit about, what it takes to do that? Maybe what some of the methods are that you used?
Yeah. So it's can be really hard to find money, follow the money, right? We call it follow the money. So what I did, what first interested me in writing this book was that I was seeing these students on these college campuses that were promoting campus carry, these laws that would allow young people to have guns on campuses. And I was told by the young people that they were just doing this on their own and that they were finding their state legislatures, they were lobbying, and they were helping, they were getting these laws passed. I just did not think that this was happening. These kids were doing it on their own. So I started looking at their organizations and trying to figure out, the campus carry was the movement at the time, was what they called them. And I started to try to find out where where they were getting their money. And so what I did was I was able to sort of trace that money back to the Gun Owners of America, which is a very extremist pro-gun organization that makes the NRA look like it's moderate. And they were pumping a lot of money into this organization to fund them. One of the things that we know is that now organizations that receive money from donors don't have to tell you who the donors are. That's because of some of the recent Supreme Court rulings over the last couple of years that makes our job as a journalist more challenging. However, what happens when you're reporting on the right-wing ecosystem, it's like a club. And there's probably like 10, 12 major billionaire, multimillionaire donors, and they all give to the same things. It's like as if they all go to the same restaurants or they all go to the same country clubs. They all give to the same organizations. So one way that I tell journalists and young journalists, if you're looking to find out, if you have a right-wing organization and you're trying to figure out who is funding it, one thing you want to do is get that list of the big donors, and then you want to actually go backwards and you want to start to look at their foundations, because their foundations are required to tell people where they're putting money in. And it's surprisingly, because they give so uniformly, it's actually not, it's quite easy, but you need to take the time to do it.
One of the things also that you mentioned in the book is that good skill making social media messaging is really important in reaching younger people. And so this kind of made me wonder if the strategy is different for that audience. And the reason I say that is because a lot of the things that I see from accounts associated with organizations like the ones you write about, it seems to me like the same kind of trolling and outrage bait that you'd see from others. But I'm wondering what are like specific strategies that might work better with a youth audience.
So yeah, I mean, I think that the visuals can be different, and it's, I find as a 53-year-old, I see this even on going to conferences and young people do these decks, and they're filled with all these things, and I'm like, this is very confusing, and I don't know why that has anything to do with that, but it seems like the young people in the audience are like really responsive to it. They get it. So I do think they're visually, a lot of times you'll see stuff that's a little bit different. But the thing that's important to understand about doing social media and the way the right-wing ecosystem does social media for young people is that groups like Turning Point USA spend thousands and thousands and thousands of dollars a year testing social media. They do this kind of A/B testing. And when I was in the Turning Point USA headquarters in Arizona a couple of years ago, one of the heads of the organization literally sat me down and showed me how the organization will create a meme or create some sort of little video, and they'll put a pair of sunglasses on the person, and then they'll test it and see how it does. Then they'll take the sunglasses off and they'll test it and they'll see how it does. A blonde, is that going to work better than a brunette? Big lettering, little lettering, baseball cap, no baseball cap, beard, no beard, red dress, green dress. They test it all. This is very, very expensive. And people think of social media as cheap. It's not. It's expensive, and this group and other youth groups receive a tremendous amount of money from right-wing donors to do stuff like this to make sure that they are capturing the youth vote. I mean, not the youth vote, but the youth, the youth eyeballs.
So that's interesting because not only is that very expensive, but it's also a relatively sophisticated strategy, right? And so it seems to me that if you had groups that really were sort of these grassroots things that had grown up out of nowhere, that they might not have the sophisticated, kind of knowledge of digital marketing to do that.
Oh yeah, these groups, these youth groups on the right, you walk into their offices and they look like Silicon Valley startups. They're not, and there's a strong contrast between the way they look and are run, and the way progressive youth groups look and are run, largely because of the amount of money that gets pumped into them. But they are serious operations. They are not playing games. These are serious operations that run like businesses.
Could you maybe share a couple specifics about like the differences in how they look?
Yeah, sure. So when I was working on my book, Raising Them Right, I spent some time in Arizona at Turning Point USA, which was in a warehouse in this huge, huge building, and computers everywhere and multiple rooms and mock-ups and they were experimenting with colors and this and that, and they had development department and a social media department and a growth of they had their own TV studio that hooked up to Fox News, that linked up to Fox News. They had a little makeup section, and then then they had a whole other wing for social media work and videos and whatnot. That same trip, I then went over to look at one of the progressive organizations that was working also in North Carolina, in Arizona rather, to get out the vote. And this was September of 19. It was September of 19. So it was a year and a half before the election, right? Or yeah, a year and a couple months before the election. And what I found over there was one guy. First of all, I waited for about an hour and 15 minutes for the head of the organization to show up. And because she was so overworked and had so many things going on, she finally kind of stumbled in. We were on the second floor of some ratty-tatty building. And then I found some guy who was the first hire. He had a little beat up laptop. What he was doing that day was trying to figure out how to plug it in to the wall and get it to work. So that is a pretty good visual of the difference.
One of the things that I read with my freshman students is an article called On a Christian Mission to the Top, which was published in the New York Times probably about 20 years ago. It's about something called the Christian Union, which targets Ivy League schools mostly, with the idea that they're going to grow influential supporters for basically government enforcement of religious priorities, right? So it's another long game kind of thing. In your work, it seemed like there was kind of more of an interest in getting workers first and then voters kind of second. And I'm wondering about the organizations that you've studied, if they're more interested in sort of getting support in the present, if they're more interested in developing for the future, maybe it's kind of like a multi-part strategy, how that works.
Yeah, it's really interesting. I love that you mentioned this organization and that it says union in its name, because what the radical right has done over the last 50 years is bring together a very strong coalition of seemingly different groups that might not have a ton in common. So you have oil industry donors, and then you have Christian nationalists, and then you have the gun. Here you have a bunch of evangelical Christians who believe deeply in their God, and then they align themselves with the National Rifle Association. Then what you have is a effort to divvy up the work. So we need a social media arm that can really go out there and help figure out how to talk to people online. We are going to need a lot of training for these young people that we're recruiting on college campuses. So let's get someone to start the Leadership Institute, which is a training academy for right-wing students. We're going to need lawyers. So let's start the Federalist Society so we can get our lawyers trained so they can fight in court for our values. And then, of course, let's get thinkers. Let's start think tanks. And so that's where you need to have these elite thinkers and well-educated young people to build cases for our ideas, right? And to base those cases in what would seem like academic research. Once you do that, you build a movement, and then that movement can help to get more and more people to the polls, because you're creating something that is like either pushing legislation you like or pushing ideas you like. And but also in this whole ecosystem, of course, is also sort of like the get out to vote groups. But those are generally really they look a little bit different than on the left. The youth groups are work very, very hard. Homeschool groups, they are considered, those young people are considered soldiers, and they go out and they door knock. And then of course, evangelical churches and ministers are also hugely important in getting out the vote. So you see, it's kind of an ecosystem, and everybody has it.
Yeah, that makes sense. One of the things that you suggest is that more left-leaning groups are less well organized and a lot less well funded, particularly for initiatives supporting young adults. I'm wondering, why do you think that is?
Yeah, so I think there's a bunch of reasons. I think that uh, these right wing groups are really, like I said before, they're run like multinational corporations and funded by incredibly gifted CEOs, so these are people that are very serious about growing their businesses and are very serious about growing these organizations and grow them as if they're not they're nonprofits, but they kind of grow them as if they're for profits, those structures and the way they think about them, and they pay their people very, very well. The donor base is very faithful. So when I was saying before that, it's like a club and there are these donors and they all give the same organizations, that is really helps to grow organizations that are supporting these ideas, because the money kind of comes in consistently. What happens on the left is that, first of all, the organizations are not always as well run. These people who run these organizations are not always as well paid. And the donors on the left are much more fickle. They may like an organization one year, but they tend to sort of like progressive and democratic donors really like shiny things. They like, what's the new thing? Well, tell us what the new thing is, which makes sense, right? Because progressives think about the future and conservatives see themselves as more traditional, whether or not that's true. But that you do see that in the way that they give, because conservatives decide, I like this group, I'm going to stay with this group for the next 30 years and watch it grow. That's where my money's going. Where progressive donors are more, and I see this because I work with progressive donors at times, and I watch them, and they are always like, well, who do I give to now? And you may have told them about some wonderful groups that are doing great work, and they give a little money to them, but then the next thing you know, they want to know who else to give to, because they want something new. So that's part of it. Finally, the relationship that these donors have with young people is very different on the left and the right. There's a lot of internecine warfare among young people and on the left and donors and the more and elder members of the Democratic coalition. And there's a lot of mistrust. And I blame the elders. I blame the donors. I think that they use and abuse their young people, and they don't respect them. They get mad at them when they get mad at them when they get engaged in politics. They get mad at them when they don't get engaged in politics. They underfund them, so they say their vote isn't really going to matter. And then when the Democrats lose elections, they blame the young people. So it's a kind of a mess pot over there. Whereas on the other side, the donors have this really, I found really lovely relationships with young people. They funded them, they gave them money, some of these donors had extremely personal relationships with very sometimes important, big deal members of these organizations, and sometimes just new members. Completely different relationship.
I'm thinking back to the part in the book where you kind of went inside Leadership Institute training, and you were talking about how some people were going to these, weekend-long, I think, workshops, right, that were super intense, many hours a day, and it didn't seem like the people who were running the workshops were very nice to the people who attended. It was kind of like you're in or you're out, and you got to do all these things to stay in.
Yeah. It's intense. I mean, the kids come in and they know that some of them are going to be funneled in and some of them aren't. And so they're up for the job, most of them. I mean, in terms of they know what they're getting into, and they do. I mean, people who have been in those rooms and then switch sides, whatnot, will inarguably tell you that the training that happens in Leadership Institute for the young people on campuses is pretty intense and pretty high quality.
Yeah, I think some of it also is there's a clear path where you go from that, right?
Yeah, exactly.
There's a clear set of job descriptions and roles and that kind of corporate thing you were talking about a minute ago.
Yeah, there's an ecosystem for young people to plug into immediately, and a lot of folks inside the movement encouraging them to do that.
Yeah, absolutely. All right.
Also, just a final thing with one thing I saw was like a really big difference on the left and the right is that when in that ecosystem that on the right, young people will get it. They may not make a lot of money in the beginning, but they can eventually rise up and make quite a bit of money. There's a relationship to money and making money on the right, which is they're very comfortable with that. I think that you can do these types of things. You can get into this world, and then you can start your own businesses and make money doing various things. And on the left, that's kind of looked at a little bit. People think that's a little distasteful or whatnot. Whereas on the right, there's an idea of like, oh, hey, that's good. It makes money. Get rich. It's different. So.
Different set of goals.
People can taper off on the left because they aren't being paid enough and they really do need to make a living. Where on the right, that can be part of the whole thing.
Okay. I see what you're saying. Kind of my last question may be too speculative for you to want to answer, but I thought it'd be interesting, so I'd bring it up. Two of the people that you write about in the book, Benny Johnson and Dave Rubin, were specifically mentioned in that DOJ indictment for Russia-backed influencers. So I am wondering, do you think there is a connection with kind of the networks that you're seeing and foreign influence, or is that kind of an emerging question? Or
yeah, I can't. I'm not sure, but what we do know is that they that Putin and Putin's people have a desire and have interests that ally right now with these extremist groups.
Yeah, it could be opportunistically just seeing a place where, they could fit in. Anyway, I just thought that was kind of interesting as a question. All right.
Yeah.
Is there anything I should have asked you and I didn't?
I don't know. I think this was good. I really appreciate talking to you. I thought you had an amazing question.
Oh, well, I appreciate that. And like I said, I really enjoyed your book, and I really appreciate you making the time to talk to me today. Thanks for getting Unspun with me this week. Unspun is a production of me, Amanda Sturgill, and is a proud member of the MSW Media family of podcasts. Send me your thoughts and ideas about trickery in the news on Gmail at TheUnspunPodcast@gmail.com. I even write back. And find this episode's show notes and more information at TheUnspunPodcast.substack.com. Want to learn more and get smarter? Check out my book, Detecting Deception: Tools to Fight Fake News, which is available on Amazon or your favorite online bookseller. And until next time, stay sharp, everyone.